Hello, vagina. Cheers to being a woman, but womanhood, it's a jungle down there. Get ready to be real, raw, and totally uncensored as we explore the depths of health, sex, motherhood, and relationships. Strap in for those topics that make you cringe, make you blush, and make you want to hide your face. Welcome to the Hello Vagina podcast. Hello and welcome back to the Hello Vagina podcast. With me today, I have a very special guest. We have Dr. Kate Balestrieri. She is a licensed psychologist and a sex addiction therapist. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be on your episode today.
We're definitely excited to have you here and to dive into some topics that we definitely don't talk about. Let's get started with talking about the big O, orgasms. It's something that I think a lot of women actually have never experienced or have a lot of trouble reaching.
Yes. Yes, so many women that I work with will come in because they either have never had an orgasm or they experience pain during sex that prevents them from really letting go and sinking into any pleasure that might be available to them. But a lot of women really feel like they're not having the kind of orgasmic potential that they hear other women talking about or that they might have seen in TV or movies, and certainly not what they hear when they either watch or hear the summaries of some of what they're seeing in porn.
I think that's definitely a good point is what is an orgasm? And is there a variety of things? Like, does it have to be that, I guess, movie orgasm where it's like, and it's screaming and it's pure ecstasy? Like, what degree of pleasure sensation classifies as an orgasm? I think might be something that is confusing. Like, I think movies and that wanting to scream is maybe excessive, maybe true, but not always the case.
Yeah, not always. I mean, so let's back up a few seconds and talk about just like the basic cycle of sexual arousal. So we have kind of a baseline, and we have a build-up phase where things are really exciting. Usually we'll hit a plateau phase, and then there's a build-up again into the orgasmic climax, and then a refractory period. Men have a similar cycle. Theirs tends to be longer and shorter in different places than women's cycle tends to be. So a lot of women will experience the build-up and excitation phase and then hit a plateau in the amount of pleasure that they are receiving. Mm-hmm. And they never quite get to that point of climax, right? They don't get there, or at least they don't think they do. So there are a lot of different kinds of orgasms. I love that you asked that question because so many people define orgasm as just what you said, this like over-the-top cinematic performance. But sometimes orgasms are slow and low in terms of intensity. Sometimes they're quieter. Sometimes they are more loving and tender. So they don't necessarily have the kind of vibration that you might expect when you're seeing, an episode of something on TV where someone's electric. And then sometimes there are those really electric, catch you off guard. I don't even know what's happening, but wow, thank God it is happening moments.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point because it, as someone that hasn't really, for me personally, I've never experienced sort of not being able to have one, I guess, for as long as I can remember. I've sort of, I worked out the position that works for me and, I can pass that information on and I guess be selfish at times. Like, just there, that's my spot. Keep going there, like, hold on. But like you said, it's a different variety. There's been times that it takes your breath away and does give you sort of body tingles, but that's not an every time occurrence. So for me, I feel like I can orgasm every time, but it's not always that full body sensation necessarily, wave of pleasure that we sort of hear women talk about.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So for women that do struggle to orgasm, what are some of the reasons that women might have not experienced an orgasm before?
Yeah, there are quite a few reasons that women might struggle or might never have experienced an orgasm. And they're pretty different. There's no one cookie cutter answer, but sometimes it can be a combination of a few different variables. But things to think about would include the biological composition of one's anatomy. Some women have anatomy that makes orgasming a little bit easier. Perhaps more of their clitoris is exposed. It's a little less tricky to find. They might have anatomy that just derives more sensation than other women do. Mm-hmm. And those are things that aren't necessarily to be helped, and it doesn't necessarily mean anything's wrong, but it certainly can change someone's pleasure capacity or experience of it. So aside from biological factors, anatomical factors, it's important to think about biological things going on too. So depending on where a woman is in her menstruation cycle, if she is closer to menopause or has recently had a child, her hormones can vary so much, and that can really change the way our body takes in sensations and the way we experience it from not only a physiological level, but from an emotional level.
Yeah.
So then we factor in, has the woman had a nap? Or is she busy running around doing everything for everyone like many women do? And is she able to fully relax into the sexual experience that she's having? And so there are a lot of things that can get in the way of that, of an endless to-do list, childcare needs, feeling an imbalance in terms of work and life and friends and social and family. And when women aren't necessarily in a place where they can let go of that, it can be really challenging to let go and have an orgasm. There's a ton of surrender required to let your body go into that kind of pleasure space.
Yeah. And I guess emotion, like you touched on, emotionally, guys are sort of ready to go even if they don't necessarily feel like it, where for us as women, there can be no actual physical reason why you can't do it, but mentally you just don't feel like it. So if your head can't get into the space, it's just like a giant roadblock. That's something that I have. Like, there's no physical reason why I can't do it right now. I'm getting undressed anyway because I'm going for the shower. But if I just don't feel like it, it's just not going to happen. Where if it was the other way around and your partner's getting ready to get in the shower and they're naked and you're like, let's go. Even if they didn't feel like it, they're like, yep, I could spare 5 minutes of my time right now to do this. But it's so different too. And it's like, I was listening to some couples coaching, and he was talking about wives, and he's like, don't give vaginal masturbation. And I thought it was such a funny concept. He's like, it's when you just lay there and I'm literally just masturbating into your vagina. And I was like, it's funny because there's times that you can give it and you're actually not doing a single thing. You are literally just laying there. But as a woman, there's times that I just can't even be bothered to lay there naked because it's just.
So why do you do it?
It's just not. I refuse. But there's a lot of us, I guess there's a lot of us that don't, that are trying to, give that balance. But like you said, if your headspace isn't in it, it's just not in it. And it makes it so much more difficult to get into the moment when you just not wanting to.
Totally. And, you bring up something so important, right? Women are often socialized to be of service to the people around them. Women are relational creatures. We are biologically tasked with kind of keeping all of the humans connected. Men are more biologically tasked with engendering survival necessities. And so we also have these really sophisticated, gorgeous brains that have evolved over time. So these are generalizations, and not to mean that every woman and every man is this way in a completely polarized sense, because that's not the case. Yeah. But where I'm going with that is that women often will be running around and if they're working outside of the household, then they are often balancing all of the competing needs of their jobs with that. And, women take a little bit longer typically for their arousal cycle to get going. So
Mhm.
they do benefit from saying no when they're actually not in that headspace.
Yeah.
Now, sometimes if you're not in the headspace when you start, you can give a little bit of gumption to it and then get there, right? And
Yeah.
it can be really fun. But I would say to women, if you're really not feeling it, stop, because your partner can feel your disengagement too. And
Yeah.
then it becomes this feedback loop of, we're doing this out of obligation. And both people tend to resent each other in the long run if that's the overarching or common theme in the bedroom.
Yeah, it's that sort of discussion of that she doesn't actually want to. She's just doing it because she has to. And I think
Right.
that, I guess, for women it's sort of hard to, if it's not working for you and you're not sort of getting this orgasm out of it. Um, I guess we're in a society where we're that goal driven. We think about
Hmm.
sex being successful if you reach that goal of orgasm.
Yes.
And we tend to then not focus so much on the journey and any pleasure that
Hmm.
came through the journey, but we're reaching that goal, and it's all about getting that goal. And for guys, it's
Hmm.
making, if they if they do care about that, it's making sure that they come, trying to make her come. That's the purpose of
Yes.
sex. I guess that's what we're taught sex is, that it's to make babies and to make each other orgasm, and that's sort of
Hmm.
the either or, and we don't really sort of get taught that it's still successful in between those 2 points.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think of the women that I work with and in my own friend circles, so many women talk about how they love sex, even though they might not have an orgasm every time. They're pretty unfazed by that. They can enjoy it and walk away and feel like that was a really satisfying sexual experience, even if the big O wasn't part of the equation. But I do think that we have a lot of scripts that are given to us through commercialized porn industries, through Hollywood movies, through lots of different media outlets that do reinforce this performance based sexuality for men and women. And I see a lot of people coming into treatment who are really frustrated because they think they have to be a certain way and show up a certain way sexually. It really gets in the way of them being able to enjoy the experience.
Yeah. And like you said, that's sort of, we don't really get taught. Sex is one of
No.
those areas that's so taboo. You don't talk about it
Hmm.
unless you're that kind of girl. We
Hmm.
only learn sex from a biological point of view of how we make a baby at school. Obviously, they're not going to teach you the pleasure side of sex, because that would be inappropriate to be teaching children.
Isn't that just so, well, children, yes, but not women. And
No, but that's the thing. So we don't,
yeah.
yes, when we get taught at 13, when we're doing
Hmm.
sexual education, or, 14, 15 into physical education studies and health studies, you're still that bit too young to, we don't really want to
Hmm.
be teaching children the pleasure side. But then there's no other sort of point once we become adults that you can learn it. So we then lack,
Hmm.
I guess, that stepping stone. And because it has been so taboo to talk about it, it wasn't
Hmm.
something that you then start to talk to your girlfriends about when you're in college and university and you get to
Hmm.
that stage of life, because you don't want to be that girl, you don't want to be over sexualized. So we do sort of start to talk to our friends about it, but I think there is that societal, like, you're still not meant to really talk about it. So I think for a large portion of women, they then don't ever talk about it.
Hmm. I agree. And it's unfortunate because if our bodies are capable of producing children through sex, then certainly they're capable of experiencing pleasure. And when we are not including a conversation about pleasure and advocacy for pleasure and safety in that, then we're really setting kids up for a really compartmentalized experience of sexuality. Because as you said, there's this kind of unspoken fear around reinforcing sexual pleasure, and then an expectation of all of the sexual responsibility that comes with being an adult. And so I think we kind of chasm into a very bifurcated experience of sexuality if we don't have that conversation and feel like we have women or people that we can talk to about what is normal? What are the expectations? What's hopeful in sex?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
And
it's
I think
okay to
that,
like it.
what do you enjoy? What do you like? And how do you communicate that with your partner? I guess if you have an outgoing personality, you may be a lot more likely to have those conversations because you don't have the insecurities around that, or you may still feel them, but not enough for that to stop you from having that conversation. But that's not everybody's personality type. So for a lot of people, whether it's the way that you were brought up, religious influences, or just being shy and a more easily embarrassed person, then it makes it very hard for someone that you have complete trust in to still bring up this topic of what I like, what do you like, how do we sort of find this within each other, because everybody is different in what they like.
Everyone's different.
Like what works for them and what doesn't. So what are some ways that you suggest to start that conversation, or to sort of, for women that do struggle with wanting to talk to their partner about sex?
Well, I think there are a lot of different ways to have that conversation, and so much is contingent on how the couple normally operates, what works for them in terms of setting up time to have a more meaningful conversation. But I would definitely recommend not trying to start the conversation when you're in the middle of a sexual interlude with each other, because then at that point, there can be a lot of different sensations happening already, pleasure expectations and vulnerabilities. So it can make it more difficult to stop and say, hey, actually, can we talk about this? So I would say bring it up in a non-sexual context for sure. And really, sit down and take some time to think about, what might you like sexually? What might you want more of? What are you not comfortable with, perhaps, that your partner is doing? Why are you uncomfortable with it? Or what, let's talk about the things that are happening that are great for your sexual pleasure experience, and the things that maybe have a negative impact. But I would be really cautious to be critical of your partner, whether male, female, or otherwise, because everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, but for the most part, people are coming to a sexual experience with the best of intentions for people to have a good time, for everyone to have a good time, right? So when we are shaming or belittling of what someone else finds pleasurable, that can be a fast track down to a place of feeling a lot of unnecessary fear, shame, and hesitation. And then that will obviously have an impact on orgasm potential.
Yeah, definitely. So we were discussing a little bit before about the balance, I guess, with your partner and getting satisfaction through the sexual experience. Do you have a selfish partner? Do you have a partner that's maybe not necessarily selfish, but aren't giving you what you need in your relationship? Can you touch a little bit more on that?
Yeah. Like I said, I think most partners that I work with in coupleships are trying to be attentive to their partner's needs, but it can get a little murky when you're also trying to advocate for your own sexual pleasure in the moment. But oftentimes I think, we look to blame our partners and say, well, I have a selfish partner, or my partner doesn't know what they're doing. And I think that's dangerous for a couple of reasons. It can create a lot of unnecessary distance between couples and pit people against each other, making sex this really pernicious third that just gets in the way instead of an opportunity for joining and connecting. So I bring that up to say that it really is incumbent upon each person to set themselves up for having the most orgasmic potential, right? We are responsible for our own orgasms. And in doing that, it's important to think about, how do I communicate my needs and wants to my partner? If they're not receptive after I've communicated to them, why? Is my partner not understanding what I need? And do we need to have a different conversation about it, or talk about it in a different way? Or is my partner unwilling to try something different and meet my needs? And in that case, well, why? What does it bring up for them? Or are they just disinterested and dismissive of my pleasure? And I think when you start going down that decision tree of what's happening in the relationship, it becomes a little bit more clear of, is your partner selfish in bed, or are there just things that need to be talked about first? But one of the things that I find so fascinating about it being almost 2020 and lots of women's movement and empowerment for many, many years is this idea that many women will talk with me about around feeling like they are vehicles for their partners, their male partner's pleasure. And they don't really understand that pleasure is something that ought to be sought after for the most part on a 50-50 basis.
Yeah.
And that they have the right to feel good. They have the right to have an orgasm, not in an entitled, I demand an orgasm kind of way, but everyone has the right to pleasure. But so many women feel like they just have to show up and it's their duty and obligation to be sexually pleasing to a partner. And so they don't even read their partner as being selfish.
Yeah.
And yet there might not be complete reciprocity in terms of everybody championing for equal pleasure.
Yeah. That's a very interesting point that you bring up, and something that's been a thread through a lot of different conversations that we have on the podcast, I guess, because so much has changed. And for me, female empowerment isn't so much now, equal rights, because I think we are a lot more on that equal playing field, or very close to. But it's the conversations that we weren't allowed to have because men didn't want to hear about our periods, men didn't want to hear about all these things. And because we weren't equal, we weren't allowed to talk about them, and they got shut down, and it started to become taboo, and it had stigma to it, and it all got pushed down. And this is very much, I guess, the same kind of thing where, women were there to please their husbands, and that's sort of, is that how it was for your great grandparents? And then that gets instilled in your grandparents, and then it filters down a little bit. And each generation it becomes a little less, but yet it still can be, depending on your background, it's still somewhat there in how you think about being a partner and those ideals that have been instilled into you.
Yes. Yeah. I keep coming back to this idea of women being responsible for their own sexual pleasure, right? Because, and the same is true for everyone. But I really think that in general, at least this is true in the States. I don't know if it's true in Australia. You'll have to tell me.
Yeah.
But I feel like a lot of women are more deprivational when it comes to pleasure in general. And I mean that not even sexually, but in terms of finding time for hobbies and making time for friends and for nurturing different parts of their lives might be more unique to LA or more metropolitan areas where people are trying to hustle and make a name for themselves. But it seems like the men that I work with experience less hesitance in going out and having a good time, whereas women tend to be a little bit more reined in. And I think that also has a lot to do with why women experience less pleasure in the bedroom, and really just kind of a fundamental lack of knowledge amidst men and women around how women's bodies operate and actually derive pleasure.
Yeah. And I guess that sort of comes back to school. We point out the clitoris in the anatomy picture, but it's just of like, oh, it's a vagina, oh, it's a picture of a penis. We're at an age that, yes, I guess it's the right age to teach that, but it doesn't sink in a way that they're going to remember later and be like, oh, that's right. Mrs. Smith told us about the clitoris when we were 13. We were too busy laughing at the penis pictures for it to sink in. So it's not like we said, in terms of pleasure and sex from pleasure, when we're taught about it, it doesn't have, I guess, any significance to most children. We would hope that most children still aren't having sex at 13. I know it sort of happens, but hopefully they're waiting a little bit longer. And, so for the majority of children, it has no relevance to their life. So I think we just take in information that's relevant and get rid of the stuff that's not. So, and then when we do need it, we're like, oh, I don't remember anything from that class.
Yeah.
And then, the sources that we learn from are, the television, which I guess, TV can't show you because it's not appropriate. And then porn is just this whole other area of really unrealistic sexual encounters. So men, I guess, are almost set up to fail. They don't have the information. For most part, they don't tend to go and search the information. Females will sort of research a lot more. It's more in our nature to look into things and analyze, where men, you don't see them as much sitting down. I can't imagine them sitting behind Google trying to learn more about the clitoris.
Well, I think they do, but I think they go to databases like the main porn websites, and that is their research. So the information they're taking in is pretty skewed to, a representation of something that's not realistic and generally has male pleasure as the primary focal point. And so I challenge that only because I don't think men are lazy in these efforts. I think that they're just misguided in terms of what libraries they're going to.
That's very true. Yeah, that definitely probably would make more sense that they're not looking through Wikipedia. They're looking through information, which is probably not the best source. I think porn is definitely setting everybody up for failure. In
so much failure,
pleasure.
Yeah.
So in terms of trying to, have that orgasm and getting in touch with your taking charge of your own sexual pleasure, what are some of the things that you suggest to your clients that they can do? That might be something that women are like, okay, yep, I hear that, but I have no idea where to start in trying to work out where my sexual pleasure is, or what it is, where it is, how to find it.
It's so elusive. It's a good question. So first, I would say read. There are a bunch of really great books out there that go really deeply into helping women understand how to take domain over their bodies and understand some of the areas that can impact orgasmic pleasure, and like how to think about what's relevant for your own body. So there are a couple of books that I really like. There's The Elusive Orgasm, Come As You Are, She Comes First is a great resource for couples to read together. And it can be really fun. But, give yourself information. We don't live in a vacuum anymore. We've got endless internet resources and things out there. So please put down the shame or the fear and learn first and foremost. And that would be, I think, the starting point. But then in terms of really accessing that pleasure in the moment, I think it's important to become more embodied. I think many of us live from sort of here up most of the time in our lives. And when we learn to drop in to our bodies and be more integrated and present in our sensory experience, you'd be amazed how quickly your body becomes so much more receptive to information, and pleasure is information. So things like having a yoga practice or some kind of a stretching practice can be a really great start for women. Nothing wildly vigorous. In fact, I would suggest slow and steady at first, at least, so that you can really get a solid understanding of what is the information being given to you by your body, and start to cue in more with that. Breathing exercises can help. Meditation practices can help. In terms of, there's some interesting and innovative physiological medical practices that are outside of my scope of practice, but there are some providers who will use PRP, or they'll use filler to inject the G-spot, which can also bring it forward inside of the vagina, which can increase and stimulate pleasure if anatomically pleasure might be thwarted by some of the structural influences that are your own body. So that's a thing in LA. I don't know if they do it in Australia, but
I've not heard of it, but it's not something that I've looked into either. So it probably is possible. I guess we do have a lot of the same things. So if anywhere you would find it, you would probably find it in Sydney. So yeah,
probably. Anybody who does vaginal labiaplasties or rejuvenation surgeries probably be a good resource to start with. So those are some of the physical things. Again, I would invite people to have their hormones checked. want to find out if there's something wonky in your system, that's very practical. You can go to your doctor and ask to have all of your different hormones that are related to sexual functioning assessed. And then usually there are some pretty straightforward treatment plans that can be put in place to help your body get back to an equilibrium spot, which then makes you more available for pleasure. So that's the goal.
Yeah.
And then I would say really practice communicating your wants and needs and limits with your partner. This is something that a lot of women struggle with for many reasons, but really thinking about like what feels good, and can you be intentional with your partner to say like, hey, can we just sit down one night, or I'd really like to sit down one night and just explore everything going on in my body. I'll hit you back next time. We'll do a whole night dedicated to you. But can we just play and figure out what feels good, what doesn't, and really like explore that?
Yeah. No, that sounds like some awesome ideas. And I guess they can also seek out a therapist like yourself to talk through, because I guess for some people, you know, it makes it easier to talk through these things and have somebody to sort of bounce ideas off and get sort of feedback that you're in the right direction. Because I guess it's quite a daunting feeling of trying to work this out and isolating, and to realize that you're not alone. This is something that a lot of women do. You're not the only person that has this or has difficulty in this area. You know, I think that it's probably a small minority of couples that are really in tune with exactly what they want. I think even people having a, you know, inverted comma, healthy sexual relationship still probably could have a better relationship, and they're still probably not fully talking as much as they could or exploring as much as they could. You sort of just settle for it works and we'll leave it there. What you know, a lot of people do.
Yeah, a lot of people don't want to rock the boat, which makes sense. You know, we don't want to break what's not necessarily, or fix what's not necessarily broken, but there's a lot of room for people to go deeper and further into their pleasure potential. But, you know, thinking about more of the psychological things that people can do to get themselves in that headspace or to work through any challenges, definitely work with someone who is a certified sex therapist. And there are lots of online resources you can look into to find them. People can shoot me a DM and I'm happy to connect them with resources too. But really, you know, connect with other women. And I recommend, if you don't have a solid friend group, or even if you do, you connect with other women who are, you know, trying to have this conversation and really cultivate a safe space to ask questions and to say, well, have you ever tried this? And have you ever done that? And does it work for you? Why or why not? You know, and build that kind of support, because women thrive when they feel supported, understood, acknowledged. Everybody does, actually, regardless of gender. But it's really important when we think about sexuality to feel a sense of safety and a sense of empowerment. And I don't mean that politically, but just the idea of being able to show up in your own skin as your whole self.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good point. And you know, what the podcast is about starting those conversations. You know, start it with your closest friend, you know, start it with your group. And to start to take the stigma away of talking about these things and not wanting to talk about, you know, I guess it's that saying, like, you know, you don't talk about what you do behind closed doors. And I guess that's something that, you know, that saying is something that I definitely somewhere had instilled in me from my parents, like somewhere along the line growing up, that saying of, you know, that's, you don't talk about what you do behind closed doors. It's nobody else what goes on in your life, is sort of there. But I guess I strayed off that path and decided that I wanted to talk about whatever I wanted to talk about. But I guess
me both.
It's definitely true for a lot of people that you sort of are brought up to not talk about that. So, but we shouldn't be. There's nothing wrong with discussing, you know, what you like and what you don't like, and asking if other people feel the same, because you'll probably find that there's a lot of people a lot of mothers that I speak to in the gym here definitely talk about they thought that they were alone, and then they asked their friend and they're like, oh yeah, I had that, that's normal, like, yep, I had that. But you think that you aren't until you start to have these conversations, and you're like, oh, okay. So yeah, I guess let your guard down and start small. And I guess it's not necessary, if it's a topic you've never talked about, I guess it's not an easy topic for most people to be like, so tell me about your sex life. Is not something that you generally come out and say to your friends. But I guess finding ways to bring the topic into conversation and start to normalize it within your friend group. It's not something you need to hide.
Exactly. Every single person on this planet has a relationship to sexuality. Whether they're someone who has a lot of sex or no sex, we still have a relationship to sexuality. And so I think it's so important that we actively work toward reducing any kind of shame or stigma around it, because it's a completely normal human biological imperative.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we wouldn't have been given clitorises if they weren't supposed to derive pleasure.
Yeah. And
they serve no other purpose.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that's something for people to actually think about too, is that, everything on our body has a function of some sort.
Yes.
There's nothing there that's there for no reason. Everything has a function. To not be embarrassed by the fact that it's there and it's meant to give you pleasure. That is its function.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But that's a very interesting point to end on. But it's true. And some food for thought, I guess, probably for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been really fun. Thanks so much for having me on your show.
Thank you so much for coming on. So people will be able to find you across on Instagram, and I will also link your website as well if they'd like to get in touch with you. And I'll also link those books that you mentioned as well. I'll pop the details of the books you mentioned as well for a good starting point.
Wonderful.
For people to try if they're wanting to get in touch and find somewhere to start. But thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Kate.
Thank you. Have a great day.
You too. Thank you so much for joining another episode of the Hello Vagina podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. And if you have, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so that you never miss an episode and you're notified when a new episode comes out. Also, we would love for you to tap some stars for us and to leave a review so that others can see how much you enjoyed the podcast and what we're all about. So don't forget, hit that subscribe button. And until next time, stay beautiful.